All right, so it's time for part two of our Ethics of Care lecture. In this part of the lecture, I'd like to kind of connect the idea of feminism with ethics of care so you guys get a better understanding of where the ethics of care came from, and so hopefully that will give you a better understanding of the theory itself. All right, so one of the first questions I usually ask in this lecture is just to kind of get an idea of what you guys know about feminism and what ideas you associate with feminism. Now, unfortunately, very often I don't get a whole lot, but I've tried to remember some of the things that people most generally tell me in class when I ask this question. One thing that kind of comes to mind immediately for many people when they think of feminism is the idea of equality, right? Specifically, the idea of equal rights and equal pay, right, for women and men, right? And then the other thing that kind of comes up very often is the idea that feminism focuses on women's issues, right? Some people also mention that feminism strives for social justice, and that there's certainly truth to that. But one of the things that sort of I think is important for people to understand about feminism is that there are actually many different theories of feminism that deal with the concerns that we just mentioned, like equality, for example, actually very differently. So I was going to go over two just to kind of give you guys a very brief understanding that feminism is not just one thing. Okay, so let's take a look at that example of equality, right? Again, something that many people do associate with the idea of feminism. Okay, so there's a theory called classical feminism, and in classical feminism, the idea is that equality basically means equal rights, and then that means specifically the idea that for women to be treated equal simply means that women should be treated the same way that men are already treated. Okay? That's the classical sort of feminist approach to equality. To give you one famous example of this sort of feminism, right, we can think of the suffragettes, right, those people who argued that women deserved the right to vote, right, and so for them, what it meant for women to be treated equally was that they be given the rights that men already had, right, that they be treated just like men. Men had the right to vote, and so equality for the classical feminist was that the women should have the right to vote as well. Okay, now again, that sounds good in theory, right? But if you stop for a second and think about it, this version of equality can set people up for certain problems, right? So one of the issues with classical feminism is that women aren't just men. They are different from men. And so there might be some worries about saying that to treat women fairly or to treat them equally means simply treating them like men are treated, right? And so one example that I talk about a lot, right, is the idea of health insurance, right, and what health insurance covers, right? Let's say a particular health insurance decided to deny all its members preventative breast cancer screenings, right? And then their reasoning for doing this was because breast cancer doesn't affect men all that often, right? Well, look, that certainly seems unfair, right? But on the classical feminist definition of equality, it's hard to explain what's wrong with this, right? Because they're, in a sense, treating men and women equally, right? In a sense, right? Nobody gets breast cancer exams. But by treating women the same way you're treating men, right? Again, men aren't getting breast cancer exams either, right? There's something unfair about how the women are being treated, despite the fact that they're getting the same thing that men are getting, right? And so again, many people think that this version of feminism maybe doesn't go far enough. Okay, so a different view of feminism is called radical feminism, right? And again, these are far from the only two views of feminism that are out there. These are just the two that I think are an easy contrast to give you guys an idea of some of the differences. So radical feminism proposes a different view of equality, right? Radical feminists argue that equality necessitates understanding and honoring the actual differences between men and women, right? The idea being that simply treating women like men are already treated is not going to lead to an equal society, right? One example of this that sometimes gets talked about more recently would be the idea of feminine sanitary products, right? So, for example, Scotland just recently voted to make these things free, while in the U.S., many states still tax them as quote-unquote luxury items, right? This actually was just changed in Illinois, I think, a couple years ago, right? So that they are at least tax-free here in Illinois now, right? But the idea is, well, look, in the classical feminist view, right, that would be fair because men are paying taxes on it, right, on feminine sanitary products, and so are women, right? But the radical feminist says, well, look, if we really want to treat women the same way we treat men, right, then since men don't have to pay for things that they need, right, to get through their daily life, there's no reason we should charge women for the things that they need to get through their daily life, right? And understanding that women are different than men, right, would lead you to understand that while men do not have to pay for feminine sanitary products, women do if they want to go through their normal everyday life. And so you should make it as easy on them as possible, whether that be, like Scotland's done and making them free for women, or at the very least, right, not kind of considering them luxury items, as they still are in many states, and taxed that way. Okay. All right, so again, that's just an example, right? And so radical feminism would say that you really treat women and men equally in terms of feminine sanitary products, would be to say that they're at the very least not taxed, if not free. All right. So again, as I mentioned, right, this example of classical versus radical feminism is just to give you sort of a little bit of flavor into understanding that feminism is not sort of one thing, right? There is not just one feminist theory. That it is in itself a highly diverse topic, right? I once took an entire semester, right, just exploring different theories of feminist philosophy, feminist thought, right? And so obviously we don't have time to do that here, but I just wanted to give you guys kind of a small understanding of that idea. All right, so despite the fact that there are these differences between different theories of feminism, in academic subjects like philosophy, there are a couple of common criticisms that feminists often level against the history ideas. Right. Another way of saying this is to say that that most feminists believe that certain mistakes pop up again and again in the history of ideas, right, which is partially philosophy, but other subjects as well. Because in these academic fields, right, women's point of view were not allowed to participate in the debate, right? So if you don't have any women being able to bring their own ideas to the table, right, the argument is you're going to lose some important perspectives on the truth of the world, okay? And so the ethics of care is considered a feminist theory of ethics, in part because the critique it makes of traditional theories of ethics, like Kantianism, like utilitarianism, right, share many of the ideas with the more general critiques of the history of ideas that feminists make, right? So the ideas we explore in the next part of the lecture, where we look at Virginia Held's negative philosophy, right? Her negative philosophy draws from some of these general feminist critiques of the history ideas, and she's just going to kind of put her spin on it to deal with her addressing specifically what's left out in ethics. Okay, so again, in other words, right, ethics of care is considered a feminist theory of ethics because it attempts to really reintroduce the perspectives of women into ethical theory. And so certainly, right, it's important to kind of reflect back on what I said in the first part of the lecture, where we were talking about a jury of her peers, right? Part of the idea of that story was, right, that the women's perspective in the story, the women in the story, their perspective was constantly disparaged, constantly made fun of, and that a more fair trial for many would have accounted for their perspectives that the men in the story were kind of leaving out, right? So again, there's a connection between a jury of her peers, right, feminists generally, and what we're going to talk about in the next section of the lecture, which is Virginia Held's specific account of